Hello and welcome back to In the Box Part 5, following our review of Part 4 where we looked at setup, calibration of the monitors, headphone considerations, etc. Now I've got 3 different ProTools sessions, and in the first 2 I'll work through a couple of the ideas by extension from the earlier tutorials where we set up basically for pre-mastering and check our levels and check our bus structures again. In this first piece I want to touch on a few things we've been talking about recently and researching really in terms of a couple of projects that are on by students. This one's along the lines of what sample rate to work at, what bit depth to work at, and generally in these 3 parts I'm going to work through increasing the sample rate as we go along, and indeed for the mastering session at the end lifting it again to 32-bit. This particular session was originally constructed entirely with virtual instruments, and part of the theory out there is that it's generally fine to track at 44.1, 24-bit, and in the case of virtual instruments you might find, particularly in ProTools and some other DAWs, that this actually increases the overheads greatly on the DAW. So in this particular piece I've written the piece and put it together with the use of VIs, but then printed them all to audio tracks when I've got the arrangement the way I want it, and then used ProTools to upsample by saving a copy in a higher sample rate. So this means it's all printed now in tracks. The virtual instruments are still there but bypassed, and all of which saves computer horsepower and CPU and puts much less demand on the system at 96K. But the real reason in the theory, if you have a look at some material getting around, say including the Lavery white papers, talks about optimum sample rates, the theory behind that is really the tracking isn't quite so much of an issue, because to make full use of high sample rates you really need all of the external equipment to be in place. So generally the thinking is that the tracking for 44.1 or 48 is quite fine, but where the 96K benefits kick in is in terms of mixing, and particularly plugins. And my experience in just simply converting these pieces to 96K, I'm hearing better bass response, I'm hearing better high frequency, and generally as you apply more EQ and more compressors, I can begin to hear the benefits of using the increased sample rate in the mixing session, and particularly given the fact that most modern plugins these days are optimized for 96K. So basically the thinking is you get a better mix session, and in this case here I've converted all VIs to 96K audio files. So let's have a bit of a listen and a look. And as we can see, the levels on the buses and the channels are looking pretty good, round about our neg 10 area. But as we also can see, the master bus is back in level a bit. So in this particular part in relation to preparing pre-masters as a separate stage from mastering, I just want to take a look at our metering again, and just the general idea about the use of compressors, how it can help guide us. So we can see the levels are back a little bit on this, and we'll have a look at our Blue Cat meter, and it's currently set up to K14, 14 dB of dynamic range, and what we're aiming to achieve is that the peaks will be as loud as possible without peaking the system out, but we also want the RMS, the average level, to be sitting in this yellow band here, according to the Bobcat's theory for mixing popular music, etc. So let's have a look where we are right now. average RMS, average peak. So we can see overall that's a little bit low. So one, we want to lift the level a little bit, but as we lift the level, we'll see that we still haven't got the dynamic range that we're shooting for, and that's where a little bit of compression will help us. So let's lift it up. Okay, I'm just getting a little bit of peak there, so I'll pull it back. That's not bad. We'll call that a starting point. We've lifted about 7 on the way in, but you'll also notice that the RMS is still, we want the RMS a little hotter to get it in range for K14. Here we go. Lift the mic up a bit. A bit hot. See, the RMS is gradually coming up. And that's looking quite nice. So what we're doing there gradually is tweaking the threshold and the ratio and the attack and makeup gain to basically help us judge how we get that in the K14 zone. So rather than just compressors necessarily based on timbre decisions or level decisions on individual instruments, we're using a compressor just in this instance across the main bus to help us get a feel for what K14 looks like and what the dynamic range is. So in this next session, I want to take that example a step further. This is returning to an earlier piece with some guitar tracks and some virtual instruments that are once again being bounced, and the whole session upsampled to 9624. And surprisingly, that happens to be the same format as what's required for iTunes MFIT format, as we discussed in part 4. So I'm tending to work at that rate. 1, because of the destination, and 2, because of the benefits of plugins and sample rate, as we discussed earlier. This track has a bit more going on, and generally it's following the principle of applying small amounts of compression across the board, like we saw in the Sweetwater discussion in part 4. The idea of, say, for radio broadcast, where we have gentle amounts of compression on the tracks, then on the buses, and I've got it running through a submaster and then finally to master. Let's have a bit of a look and a listen. So on the drum track, for instance, we have a little bit of compression on the bus, a little bit of hard knee, just to precondition that track. Also added some EQ, tidy it up. On the guitar tracks, some EQ, a little bit more comp, a bit of a soft knee. Okay, so on the tracks there's a bit of a tidy up with individual compressors and a little bit of EQ, but then they're routed to their buses, where we kick into another stage of maybe some bus EQ, a little bit to tidy it up, but also some more gentle compression now that we've preconditioned it. So let's, for instance, have a look at the Neve strip with the drum track, and in this case it has a multi-band compressor on it, 4 bands. You might remember in part 4 we talked about Ian Shepherd's production advice site, where he was very keen on multi-bands. He actually recommends using a 3 bands, but I've used 4 here. band 1, 2, 3 and 4, and you can see the ozone unit is quite straightforward to use. It's simply separate compressor controls and thresholds for each of the bands that are set in various frequency ranges, etc. Close that up, and let's go down the chain a bit more. And on the submaster here, I have some Melder Productions dynamic EQ, which is quite subtle. It's just gently riding the mix. Very nice visual readout. Threshold or expansion, range, spectrograph. Okay, so let's pause that there. And then finally we go to the master bus. And here we have our Klanghelm again. We're kicking that up a little bit at the end, given that all of our tracks and buses are pretty much metering where they should be. There's got a little bit of mixing on there now, mixing levels. And we'll have a look at our Blue Cat audio strip. And again, we're set up to K14. Got the meters set at neg 14. And let's just have a bit of a listen to that. I've got this slightly on the hot side, but have a look at the RMS average and the peak average. So there we go with that one, and what we'll do here is preparing for mastering. We're monitoring all this back through a pre-master track, and we're going to print it. We'll just print a section here, set it up, arm it, and we'll just drop that down. Okay, so there's our pre-master. Let's say we had the whole track printed. Now we take that, find it in the list. There it is. Right click and export that clip as a file. And here, what we have the opportunity to do is increase our bit depth. Okay, interleaved 32-bit 96K. So again, part of the theory floating about that is that 32-bit floating point is a nice format for mastering because it gives increased resolution. It also creates much larger files, but we're only dealing with 2-track files now, so that's fine, and we'll export that to a directory. And here we are in a mastering session with a variety of different 2-track pre-masters loaded up. As we can see, our mastering session is set up for 96K, 32-bit floating point. And my particular method here is I have a different track and different channel strip for each of the tracks, and then I tend to try and balance them out if I need to via our meter and gain adjustments. And then each of the tracks is running through a, in this case, a Manley Massive Passive mastering equalizer, UAD plugin. Like most of the plugins used here, they're UAD. I like the UAD stuff a lot, and this is a particularly nice emulation of the Manley. Think of that as a pre-EQ. It's before the master, and the idea is to try and even out each of the tracks and get them to sit a little bit better. If you've been following the other series and following the gain structure and some of the VU and the strip features throughout, if you're doing a single project with, say, a group of band tracks for an album or for an EP or perhaps a film soundtrack, the discrepancies between the pieces probably won't be that great if they've been mixed and assembled according to similar conventions throughout. In this particular mastering session, though, I've got different tracks from very different periods and different contexts, so there's quite a bit more discrepancy in how they work and a bit more of a challenge to put together essentially what would be a compilation album. But having said that, I think that's probably a pretty good training exercise for you to get your head around how the various features work. So I've deliberately made it a little bit more difficult by mixing and matching these tracks. The first one here is the one we've been listening to previously. Okay. And I haven't got anything armed on the mastering strip yet. The second one is very different piece from a different time and place. A lot more ambient. Bigger verbs. We'll return to those in a bit. The third one is a acoustic guitar featured track that's part of a movie soundtrack. Okay, very different piece of music. The third one is a electroacoustic piece. This one featured rewiring Ableton Live into tools and using some granular synthesis and so forth. It's actually a remix and interpretation of a John Cage piece called Metamorphosis. Very, very different material. Okay. Next piece is from another movie soundtrack, but actually within it there's very different sections of music depending on the scenes. So I'll just roll that forward to about there. This one features a bit of hurdy-gurdy from Kim Cunio. Okay, so you get the idea. They're all very different, and basically what we're doing in this is using the gain structure and the Manley to try and even them up a little bit. There's various approaches to mastering. I referred to some of those on part 4 of In the Box, but this is the way I've chosen to set up this one. Obviously I could have lots more plugins on the tracks if I wanted to, but I kind of like this general idea to even them out this way and then give them a mastering touch with a constant set of tools on the master bus. Before we just have a close look at the Manley, I just remind you that the idea of having a reference track or a series of reference tracks is a good idea to get your head in the right space in terms of stereo field, EQ, dynamics, overall loudness levels. Just have a bit of a listen to this one again. Okay, I like everything about that particular track. That's from El Di Meola. Great sense of space, great sense of production, beautiful playing. That's from the album called Pursuit of Radical Rhapsody, and it's a track called Firefly, and there's where you can buy it from. But just a bit more about that. Paul Blakemore is the mastering engineer. There's a reference to an interview with him online at Mix Magazine. It was recorded in Henson Recording Studios in LA, and there's some information about that studio and how it works. And finally, there's a film clip on YouTube about the making of that album in that studio with El Di Meola at the production helm. Let's go back to one of these tracks, and we'll just have a listen to a bit of the first track and have a look at the Manley. In mastering, gentle moves are the thing. You never want more than a couple of dB here and there, and if you're doing more than that, you'd have to question what the original track was about, really. Being a mastering EQ, this is set up with subtlety in mind, and basically these are the two left-hand and right-hand EQ channels that are linked. We have filters and levels, but basically they link together, as you can see. They have preset bands, which are what Manley have chosen as some useful mastering bands, and have the extraordinarily good bell curves and shapes in the way the EQs interact. At the top here you can see we can select whether it's a boost or cut. So in this case it's a boost, but in this case Actually, that's further cutting the sound, cutting that frequency, 560 in this case. And also if we use a shelf or a bell curve. So just have a listen to the amount of range you've got in this and the amount of throw and how subtle it is. This is 68 Hertz. Very nice piece of kit. Same, we're cutting 560, let's cut it more. Okay, so that's how the Manley works, and you can see you've got that full sweep there that's really gentle and very transparent. And basically through all of these tracks I've applied slightly different level matching, slightly different EQ curves in order to try and to get these things to sit together as a collection of works. As I said, no mean feat when you've got diverse works like this, but then again, that's a good exercise as mastering a compilation album, if you like. Now let's go to where all of these are coming through the master channel strip. And as I talked about earlier, these days it's likely we may actually have different destinations rather than just perceived a single CD and various kinds of renders from that. I'd suggest we've got slightly different processes depending on whether we might be going to iTunes and MFIT, as this is, or if we're going to CD, or if we're going to vinyl, or if we're going to radio. So conceivably, this master bus could be duplicated a few times, and they might be named MFIT, iTunes, radio mix, CD, and they would have conceivably different kinds of settings in relation to dynamics or total peak, those kinds of things, and then we would print them as slightly different masters or slightly different mix masters depending on the destination. I think it's fair to say that's a different kind of approach these days given the way that how the market's changed, but clearly CD isn't the primary feature now, and we should be thinking about a slightly different kind of mix for broadcast radio and a slightly different kind of mix for iTunes, etc. So in this case, I'm running it through this master track and I'm preparing it for iTunes. First cab off the rank, and my go-to is the ATR 102, which is an emulation of a 2-track tape recorder. And as you can see, it's got this nifty open and close panel where we can actually get at the guts of it. But in the first instance, you have a lot of interesting presets to choose from. And I've chosen and tweaked one of the mastering presets, which is, I think this one. We're using GP9 tape, +6 1-inch. We're monitoring our 3 production heads. We've set our reproduce levels and our record levels. And we'll just have a bit of a look at how that's metering. We'll try track 2 this time. So it's not pushing it too hard. Bypass. Engage. So it's doing some nice subtle things to the timbre and also the stereo image. If you have a close look, listen through the headphones. That's probably because of things like wow and flutter, tape sound, and crosstalk, which are turned on. So there's a little bit of feed between left and right. I've chosen to turn off transformer noise and overall general mechanical noise. Don't know why you'd want that, but it's a complete emulation. Second unit is a bit of a monster, but this is again my go-to. It's again UAD, and I think of this as my post EQ. So I've got the Manleys on the track to do that kind of mastering EQ, and on the return through the main bus I use the Brainwork BX. It's a bit simpler than it looks. Basically I'm using it in MS mode, so I have separate control over here over the mid, the mono, and separate control over here over the stereo. So let's kick that in. We'll play a bit more of that track. I'll bypass it. Okay, so straight away we got some different things going on with the width. And it's a MS mastering processor and EQ. So let's have a look from top to bottom. We've got bandpass filters coming in, both separately for the stereo and the mono. I've got those filtered at 30 Hz and 18 Hz on the mono, 18 kilohertz, sorry, on the mono section. One of the theories getting around is that's generally a good bandpass area for mastering. In the case of the stereo section, though, I've chosen to leave the top wide open because I'm going to use another EQ tool after this, and I want the air as much as possible. On the mono section, there's some gentle EQ going on. You can solo just the mono. I might fire up a slightly different track. Let's try this one. Solo the mono. So we can play around with the bass shift. You see that's quite nice. It pumps up the low frequency, but also gives you this little pull-out curve. We can trim this up and change the bands as we like. And similarly for the sides, it will allow us to solo that, and solo anything we touch on the board for that matter. Mono, sides, and that's rolled off a bit more on the bottom and just kicked up a little bit at the top. It's got a present shift, same idea. We can kick that up with a little curve after it. And this frequency here, 600 with a fairly wide Q, just got a little bit of boost on that, because again, one of the thoughts out there on the web is that a slight rise at 600 on the sides is a useful thing, generally for overall timbre, but below 600 we're just rolling it off and having it fall away a bit. I'll just go to another track and have a look at a couple other features. Stereo width, it's got complete control over that. So look, if I center that again and we'll have a listen, and let's widen it right up. Quite extreme with it, or narrow it for that matter. I like, for these tracks I came up with about the 140% mark. That's the first thing. So you got the stereo width. My other favourite piece is this piece down here called the Mono Maker, where you can set any frequency and below to be completely monophonic in the center of the mix. Very, very useful for bass. So let's have a listen to that. Okay, so I'm using it, maybe around the 95 mark, 100 mark. So stereo width, mono middle, and these other couple of nifty little tools who they call the S's, but really they're frequency dependent compressors. So you can zero in on something in the mix you want to have a listen to and just compress that frequency range. I'll go back to, say, the first track here, and we'll have a listen to it by soloing it. So at the moment it's up at 3K. Let's pull it back. So when I get into some of that rumble, I can just clamp down on that to whatever degree I want. Okay, and the same goes for the other de-esser. Let's have a listen to that and say I'll go for a higher frequency. So I might be looking for something harsh in the mix. Say about there, and we'll pull that back a bit. Let's have a listen to the whole thing. Width, EQ mono, EQ sides, a couple of de-esser compressors, mono maker, and of course overall balance controls and gain controls. Really nice piece of kit that. I like the Brainworks a lot. Next in the chain, I mentioned I've got just a little bit of high-end EQ. Let's remind ourselves. We'll go back to the reference mix. Yeah, there's so much nice air up the top there. So that's one of the things I'm picking up on. So I'm going to open up this Clariphonic, which is a plug-in emulation of a very, very nice piece of hardware. It's got a selection of frequencies down a bit lower, which I've chosen not to use because I'm just really interested in the air. And in the air up the top here, under this clarity knob, there's basically 4 different frequencies: sheen, presence, shimmer, silk. And they have different curves and different phase relationships to them. And they go from lower to higher as you move through. So I'll just give you a listen to a few of those. We'll go for, say, sheen, and I'll run a bit of maybe the acoustic guitar track there. That's the sheen. This presence. Shimmer. And finally silk. I think you can see what that does. It just provides a little bit of overall clarity and high air. I'll put that on another track for comparison. Let's have a listen to the electroacoustic track. Really add some stuff up there. Okay, that should give you a bit of an idea what that does. Made by Kush Audio, nice piece of kit. Or you might have another favourite EQ that gives you some nice top end just for that bit of extra bit of air up the top. And then of course the last thing in the chain, well actually the second last thing in the chain to be truthful, but generally the last thing in the chain, is a mastering limiter. And this again is where you need to be really careful about what you're shooting for and how hard you hit it. I'm not using a UAD here. I do like the Slate Digital plugs a lot. It's a 2-stage processor, and again I guess it follows that line of thinking about preconditioning stage and then a finalizing stage. So this is the FG limiter, which is a pretty powerful beast, but just for the moment we're going to turn that off. And this is the sweetening compressor stage. Very transparent, just used very gently as per typical mastering, just a little bit, just a dB here and there. And we'll have a listen to a track. Say we'll go to the we'll go to this track again. Let's turn it on. There's our threshold, there's our compressor ratio, attack and release. You get a fairly long attack, shorter release. And there's my threshold, so only about a dB or so. And then what I've tried to do with my balancing setup across the board is to get this reacting close-ish to the same for different tracks as we move through them. It's a bit hotter, not too much though. Still about a dB. Next track. Similar, a bit more bass in that. I might go back and tweak the bass a little bit on that track, but not bad. Our acoustic track. We'll have a drum kit and bass kick in. Yeah, pretty close. Okay, so we're using that first gentle compressor to precondition all our different tracks and also give us a little bit of a reference point if we need to go back and tweak any of our gain structures, or indeed just change the level on the faders a little bit. But it is a good reference point, particularly for the pre-EQ, because I think you might have noticed on two of the earlier tracks there, the bass tends to push it a little bit more. But basically we're using that gentle transparent compressor to even out the mixes. Listen to the first track. Bypass. Very transparent. Okay, so that's that part. That's stitching and gluing the tracks together just a little bit more consistently. But now we'll turn to the limiter, which is quite a beast. Let's zero all of these other controls, and we'll just have a look at the gain structure. Now, as we lift up the levels, it'll get louder in the mix. So they have this nice button to give us constant gain monitoring. So it'll stay at the levels we're listening to now, but allow us to hear just timbre changes, and then we can throw that out later to have a listen to our overall perceived level changes. At the moment, we'll leave that in. A couple other things. It's got dither turned on, and if we set that up, in this case it's set to 24 bits. Remember, we're working at 32 bits in our session. So when we drop it out for iTunes, it'll move down again to 24 bits. If we were going to CD, we'd use 16-bit dithering. And I've set my ceiling to -0.3, which is a good mastering standard. You'll see that about in some of the white papers. Also in a very good mastering manual that Ozone put out for free download. Isotope Ozone Mastering Manual. Very good piece of tool, that one. Let's turn it on, and let's go to this track with some larger drum kit there. And we'll start kicking up the limiting. And you can see on your metering what's going on with our RMS. And we're really starting to slam it now. And now we can hear it flattening, and that's really quite extreme. So as we can hear with constant gain monitoring, it's extremely transparent, which is why I like it. So let's say I'm shooting for a bit hotter, maybe around the 10 to 12 range. I know Bobcats talks about K14, and that's a very good reference point, but in reality we're trying to be a little bit competitive too, so I'm not a fan of slamming it too much, but this will probably be a little bit on the hotter side. So let's just have a look at our RMS levels. Okay, we'll try another track. We'll leave it about there for now. Let's have a look at these other controls. Low punch, detail, dynamic perception, and this intelligent processor. Very unusual on a limiter. In fact, you can actually increase the perception of bass and low punch, increase the perception of the kind of detail in the mix, and also increase your perception of overall dynamics within a limiter. And I think they're unusual, so we'll have a listen to those and get a bit of a feel for it. Perhaps this track here again. Here we go. Punch. Bass. Detail. Yeah. Dynamic perception. So it's getting a bit hotter now. 10. Let's drop it back a bit. And this basically gives you a smoother sound, particularly in the lower frequencies, and this gives you a harder sound, much more like rock and roll. Might just pull that back a little bit. And let's see what we've actually got. We'll run that again, but this time we'll bypass the constant gain monitoring. Here we go. We've got a nice hot mix there. Check it on a few other tracks. Around the 12 mark. Let's try it on this one. Looking good. I'll try this track. One more, we'll try this track. And again, something with a larger kit in it. And a bit of this track. Metering well. Okay, the last little point there about the Slate is that whilst I've set the ceiling at neg 13, like a lot of these processors, sometimes the peak values aren't entirely correct, and consequently you'll see a variety of new tools about that feature true peak metering or true peak limiting, as if there was a untrue peak metering or a lying peak metering. Again, you can Google around for some of that, but basically it has to do with intersample peaks, and on some tools they allow you to turn on intersample detection or turn it off, probably because it's more process intensive, but basically you can have discrepancies between what the thing says it's going to do and what it actually does do. So what I've got on the very end of the bus is one of my favourite pieces of kit from NuGen Audio in the UK. These guys are pretty serious about this kind of stuff because they're involved with broadcast and television industry there, and with new standards coming out from the ITU called the loudness standards and a new measurement unit called LUFS. You can see a bit more about that on the Ian Shepherd's production advice site. But basically they're getting very prescriptive about it now, and for broadcasters, the material that's going to television, if it doesn't meet the loudness standards, it actually won't be broadcast, it goes back. So NuGen are right at the front of that in terms of very accurate tools, And the other reason I'm using it is I think the LUFS standard will increasingly impact on us in music. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but let's just have a look at this. We can see already that in spite of the fact we've set our ceiling here, and this would be like many other limiters, actually this thing is catching a few peaks. I've set it to neg3, but actually there's a slight discrepancy. However, the NuGen audio is a true peak limiter, so I'll just run up some material on that. And we can see already it's pulling it back just a fraction, 0.1 of a dB. And there are other tools around that do that, so look for true peak or intersample detection. And I just usually run that right on the end of the bus as a safeguard. Okay. So in this case, we're printing all of these bounces, mastered bounces, back to a print track. And what's going to happen to these particular pieces is they're going to be processed through a Sonox plugin that is dedicated to producing MFIT iTunes. We'll bounce that later. As I said earlier, we could conceivably drop these down for a variety of different formats, but this one's set up for iTunes using the Sonox Pro codec. I'll just disarm that, but what I wanted to do is I've got some metering plugged into the print track, the return or the output when they're actually recorded, and we'll just have a look and see how that adds up to what we've set up on our Slate and the rest of our tools. Another plugin from NuGen, like the True Peak limiter on the output. On the print track we have the NuGen Audio VSL. It's an LUFS standard. Has a lot of different options in terms of how it could be set up and what kind of formats there are, but it's True Peak as well. But basically this is the new metering standard that's being used in Britain, particularly in terms of television broadcast. It's also, these kinds of tools are appearing in America for the same reasons. That's to do with the legislation of what they call the CARM Act, but basically what that's all about is advertising being too loud on television. But as I said, my feeling is that this will increasingly begin to impact on the music market. Obviously it does already as soon as we've got music in a film soundtrack. So let's just have a look at that. Remember what we were getting out of the Slate. Now we'll have a bit of a look at the return. As you can see, the LUFS is very similar to the RMS we're seeing on the way out. Let's go to a very different sort of track. We'll try the end of this one. It's slightly different, that one, because of the way this is seeing the idea of loudness. And we'll go to another track, let's say this one. And actually if we watch the NuGen long enough, what we'll start understanding is it's averaging this over time, whereas RMS is relatively momentary. So when we're looking at broadcast standards, etc., it's giving us short-term LUFS metering, integrated LUFS metering, and a loudness range unit. So it's actually going to keep calculating over time and give us overall figures for the integrated loudness of the entire track, and that's quite different to what we're used to. Basically speaking, on the surface of it looks similar to RMS, but actually it's a good deal more sophisticated in terms of the way it calculates and continues to calculate. So as I said, in the UK now in particular, where they're making a lot of use of these NuGen tools and others, They all have true peak standards, but they all have these integrated loudness standards, and so before they deliver a television program or a documentary to broadcast, it's got to meet those standards, otherwise it gets sent back. So I hope you enjoyed this mastering series. As I said, there's a lot of different ways to do it. In part 4, for instance, there's an extremely good detailed tutorial series at Groove 3 from Michael Costa. Goes into a lot more detail than this. And Ian Shepherd, for example, at Production Advice, has another series of processes. Both of those people probably do a lot more for fee commercial mastering work than I do. My context is really for the music I write and play, and this is in the context of my home studio here. That's my particular process for this group of tools. A different track for each piece of music, evening them out as minimally as I can with some basic EQ and level, and then my preferred pathway. You may not have exactly these tools, but I think it'd be fair to say you could probably assemble a similar collection and give that a go, like a good EQ on each track, warming up with some kind of saturation, your favourite limiter, similar kind of process. The idea of post EQ to condition it and pre EQ to tidy up the overall mix. And I guess the other point was, for fun and for practice, try mixing up a few different tracks from different times, different levels of experiences you might have had, and play around with trying to develop a style and a technique around your mastering. And then when you move to another kind of session, which is a consistent view and approach, working with gain structuring and so forth throughout, I think you might find that then assembling it is much more straightforward, and you're more on top of the tools, and it's much more enjoyable. So I hope you've enjoyed the series, and see you next time.